I'm Genevieve Petit from Petit Web, and please welcome on stage Chris Moody, VP of Data Strategy at Twitter, and Yasaman Hadjibashi, CDO of Barclays African Group. So Yasaman, I'm deeply impressed because you're from Harvard. And you were at PwC and Deutsche Bank before Barclays. And Chris, you're from Twitter, but you created also GNIP, who was bought by Twitter 2 years ago. So we're going to talk about turning big data into commercial business decision. And I warn you, I'm French. My English is very poor, so please be kind with me and speak slowly, okay? What is your vision of big data journey and data effort so far?
So for me, I started as Chief Data Officer beginning of last year. And when we arrived, it was pretty much the traditional vision that I think most companies have out of data, which is data as a strategic asset to drive customer loyalty and business growth. Just because we wanted to, first of all, kick off that education journey for our wider business units in Africa, where a lot of the efforts was fragmented across data architecture, data standards governance, data management, and analytics, so front-end analytics. As we've now evolved since last year, now we have sort of adopted more of a startup culture. So we felt that the infrastructure journey, revamping our technology estate, has matured a little bit more since last year. And now we have it, defined very simplistically. So we just say, we have it, let's unlock it. So it's a treasure, it's an asset that we have. We don't need to explicitly mention it. Let's just all together, join our hands across the organization, various data owners, data stewards, system owners, and also customer portfolio owners, product owners who actually understand the front-end relationships with customers to come together and derive value out of this with our technology and skill set.
How many persons work in your team on data?
So we have a matrix organization at Barclays. In my immediate team, where I have different competencies, and I always refer to competencies in my space. It's a combination of data analytics, it's a combination of data product management, it's a combination of data architecture, data platform delivery, and data standards governance. I have approximately 120 people in my immediate team. And because I said we have a matrix organization, where I have IT resources in India, I have another approximately 120 people consisting of data engineers, developers, and also data warehousing teams in South Africa.
So Chris, same question.
Sure. So my role at Twitter, most of you are probably familiar with the fact that Twitter has a large advertising business. We actually have two businesses. The other business is our data business, which is what I'm responsible for. It's interesting because Yassi mentioned yesterday that Barclays has been around for over 327 years. Twitter has just been around for 10 years. We just hit our 10-year anniversary. And so our data journey, if you think about the data journey of a company, is just really, really compressed into a short period of time. Today, we think of our data source as being the largest public archive of searchable human thought that's ever existed, and we think we can make every business decision smarter by enabling businesses to understand what the world is thinking about any topic at any moment in time. But if you think about our data journey, it started off as, data was just exhaust from the service that we were building. And we actually kind of got into the data business by accident because people immediately got very excited about Twitter and they wanted to build applications on top of it. And we couldn't build all those applications ourselves. So we started making APIs available so people could build on top of Twitter. The reality is we envisioned people building applications, but what we found quickly is that people were far more interested in the data they could extract from the APIs than they were actually building on top of it. So for about the first 5 years of the business, it just kind of was what it was. We made data available and people found interesting insights out of it. At about the 5-year mark, we actually decided to commercialize the service through data partnerships and actually begin to commercially license data One of the companies that was selected to be a data partner was my company, Genevieve. We ended up capturing about 90% of the market, and so Twitter acquired us 2 years ago, and we're continuing on this journey to, ultimately make every business decision smarter through this amazing archive of human thought that we have. And just to put things in perspective, because you used the reference to the U.S. Declaration of Independence being, sooner than the founding of Barclays. I think about our lens through the U.S. Library of Congress, which within the personal papers section is probably the closest thing we have to a Twitter of representing the U.S.'s history. And we have a partnership with the U.S. Library of Congress. We give them all tweets from all time. The library has 55 million archived items in it that represent our nation's history from people's perspective. So 55 million items over 250, say, years. Twitter, and that, by the way, is a representation of mostly wealthy dead men. And then you look at Twitter. Twitter has 55 million versus we do 500 million ideas from across the globe every single day from all types of socioeconomic diversity backgrounds. So it really is an amazing archive, and we just spend all of our time trying to think how to unleash that power to the world.
So how much is data business in Twitter's business?
Yeah, so we report our numbers publicly. We break out data and other services into a category. And you can think, roughly 10% of the business. I'll say it's certainly a significant part monetarily, but more importantly, it's a very strategic asset for us. We think data is the best way to go into a business and explain the power of Twitter. It's far easier for, say, a CEO or CMO to understand the power of Twitter by seeing data about their business, their products, their competitors, than it is for them to open up the app and try and figure out who to follow. So it's very strategic in showing the power of the platform to businesses.
So you've been both part in the data hackathon here, and what was the output?
So I was very impressed actually seeing how much is possible within 24 hours. Because I compare it to companies where you have the first round of discussion with different colleagues and departments, and they pose a question or a problem to you, and it probably just takes 24 hours to digest the problem and come back with an initial view, versus here, what these guys have done has been truly amazing by breaking down a big challenge that was, posed on them with no sort of more concrete steering direction. Yes, they had some, let's call them mentors on the side to seek help from. But I think coming back and seeing that most of them basically had sort of like a downfall, and during late night, at midnight, or 11 o'clock at night, they almost turned their entire sort of steer and direction around and came back the next day with amazing work, some of them even demos. I was really, really impressed. So tier 2 and tier 1, by the way, both of them. I think on tier 1, what I noticed is that, because we measured them on 3 matrices, so I was part of the jury actually, business value, storytelling, and technical, which is all very important for a successful data scientist in the world these days. And I think a lot of times what we see, it's not necessarily the technical bit that is actually shortcoming, it's more the storytelling and the commercial lens. And I think that's where I also kind of saw the more bigger difference between tier 1 and tier 2. And I could probably see that because tier 1 may have had, the contributors and participants may have had more work experience, more commercial meetings, and have developed that lens, versus in tier 2, I think, was a little shorter than tier 1. But I think overall, even apart from the winners that finally got the trophy, I was impressed with the quality of the output that I saw.
Chris, in short?
I was equally impressed. It's amazing what focused people can accomplish in 24 hours. I really loved the actual premise that Unilever set up for the idea. I know I spend most of my time talking to CMOs, and what they're all asking for is a crystal ball, right? They all want to see what's going to happen next. Whether
the newspaper of tomorrow.
Yes, they want to know. They don't want to miss the next opportunity, the next trend to launch a product ahead of time, or to get their messaging pointed in the right direction. So we obviously believe that Twitter is the closest thing out there in many ways to being able to leverage 10 years of historical human thought towards driving predictive outcomes for the future. So I just overall love the premise, and I think if you look at the results again in 24 hours, it's pretty amazing what they were able to accomplish in a specific area for looking at just a year's worth of conversation.
So let's be practical now. And please give me case studies about turning big data into commercial business decision.
So the way we've started that in Barclays Africa, and I've shared some of that as part of our competition submission here yesterday. We've gone through different parts of the organization, and we literally started with the customer. So traditionally in our bank, the way big data or data was turned into commercial decisions was more proactively going out there and doing manual analysis, and then proactively starting discussions with the different sides or the different departments in the business units, because we have an investment banking division, we have a corporate business, we have a wealth and investment management business, and we have a retail and business banking business that also includes credit card and payments. And these essentially combination of MI and more traditional analytics people used to go in there and say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Trying to influence management meetings, management discussions, management decisions, investment decisions. So when I came in, I took a very, very different lens, and I think it's partially because my background, I've done a lot of product development work, design and customer experience. I said we have to start with the customer first. So when you talk to or look at research from McKinsey, typically they say 70% of your data work should go into the outside world. So, or the investment in your data space should go into the outside world. 30% should stay within the organization. For us, it was the exact opposite. So maybe just 10% went into the outside world and 90% was staying inside. So never saw the daylight. So we started with the customer by going into different sides of the business by saying, for example, what are the bigger business problems you have? We went into the transactional business, for example, and they said customer engagement. And I think the problem that we saw is a lot of times our business colleagues at a high level understand what their issues are, but then when you actually want to come in and try to drive impact with the power of data and solve for certain business problems, that more granular thinking was not there. So it was a little bit of an educational problem solving involved from our side in the data teams to help them break down these bigger problems into smaller use cases, scenarios that we could solve for with our competences in the big data space. And that's a combination of, again, big data technologies and also product management. Essentially, this person that we refer to as data wonderkind in our teams, who understands design, who understands commercial, who understands agile execution, who can navigate throughout the organization, legal teams, marketing teams.
Does this person exist in real world?
We only have 4 of those, and I had to groom them personally. So really hard. That's why we call them the wonderkinds. Unfortunately, they're really, really hard to find. What we find is a baseline skill set of maybe commercial and technology knowledge and some agile delivery experience. But then, for example, the design customer experience is missing. Somebody who actually sits down with the rest of the business and says, if I develop this model, a predictive model, let's say for helping you to predict overdraft scenarios for customers, because one of the biggest issues we had in the transactional business is customers incurring overdraft fees and leaving us as a bank. They would just get pissed off and they would just leave us as a bank. So essentially we came and said, we have to do the right thing for the customer. So we have to essentially bump up customer satisfaction, reduce churn, reduce complaints by helping these customers manage their payment obligations better. And it should not be one of those instances that you see many other banks do, sort of, pull approach where the customer has to set up limits to get certain SMSs. We said we're going to automate this and do it for you and give you 3 days of warning if we detect that there's insufficient funds in your account with personalized options for you to take action, which gave us over almost 70% of customers taking action. And then one of the options, if they are qualified for it, they can get connected to an agent and take up a product, overdraft product, real time. And 25% of those actually ended up in real product uptake, so very, very relevant. And that goes on and on. We have another one, again, for digital propensity. This same one we're taking now into the wealth and investment management business for optimizing direct debit orders The way it works on that side of our business is a lot of times we spend so much time doing cold calls of onboarding customers and selling our products. And then once we sell them, because we haven't done any analytics, they do not actually get activated. So our strike rate is really, really bad. So now we are trying with sort of using the same approach and the same model or the same, now we treat it as a product. We go into the wealth and investment management business and we're saying, can we predict what is an optimized payment date for this direct debit order to incur in that customer's account, and hence reducing the churn amongst our newly onboarded customers in the wealth investment management. So going back to your question, what's the return? We go initiative by initiative, and at the end of the year, we just sum it up all together and say, overall, how much did we invest across all these initiatives, and what's the return we drove? Some of the return is top-line concrete impact, like revenue generation, cost savings, if you go into the ops space and talk about collections, for example. And some of it is just doing the right thing and driving up customer satisfaction and NPS scores.
Chris?
Yeah, so we're actually in the business of licensing data, and it's very clear that our business is only successful if businesses are able to find ROI in the services that we provide. The fascinating thing for me, and I realize this is a data conference around marketing, and it's obviously where we spend most of our time too, but it's really interesting to see now that, at least from our data perspective, the data really is reaching all areas of the enterprise. And I'll give you a couple examples outside of marketing just to kind of open up the brain waves of interesting things that are happening. We're seeing companies use Twitter data for things like inventory management. Now this is, inventory management is something that companies solve for, maybe on a retail perspective 20 years ago. 20 years ago, they started knowing exactly what was on the shelf and what wasn't on the shelf. But now, through this new lens, well, what does the world think is on the shelf? They get a totally different perspective. So they'll use our data to see what consumers actually care about in terms of inventory levels. So we have, retailers looking and saying...
Which brands do this?
So I'm not going to talk about any particular brands, but some of the largest retailers in the world now are actually looking at consumer data to say, the customer is saying, I can't believe they're out of this particular brand of diapers. I'm going to go across the street to have to buy them. Or, which could be a case where they're getting this new view of demand that they didn't understand before. Or it could be as simple as they believe those diapers are in stock, but they were shelved by the stock person, and so now they're getting actually a different view of their inventory than they've had in the last 20 years. When we tie back to the hackathon, and I'll give you my personal experience on this and why I think the hackathon work is so important for brands, just as a simple example. So my middle son, when he was 5 years old, he developed a fever every 21 days. It was this bizarre thing. And we did some research and we realized there was this condition out there, and the only treatment was steroids, which we weren't super excited about. So we went to see a kind of a holistic pediatrician, and he said, I've seen this once before, and the kid went off gluten, and that, the fever went away. So we obviously were up for trying that, and we did, and it worked. Now, I don't know if any of you have young children, but my young children have a very limited palate, and so taking away gluten from an already very limited diet was really challenging. One of the things we found was one of the most popular cereals that my son liked was actually contained no gluten. So, 5 years ago, we started, buying more and more of this particular brand of cereal. Last year, that brand actually began advertising the fact that they were gluten-free. Now, there's almost no doubt, and I don't have any actual insights about this particular brand of cereal, but there's almost no doubt that at some point they had to explain why their sales numbers were growing so tremendously. And at some point, someone in marketing probably figured out, hey, it turns out that people that are celiac or have other gluten intolerance, are buying this cereal more and more. That's the power of the hackathon, is the consumer was raising their hand 5 years ago saying, we care about this and we like this about your product. It just took a very long time for the company to figure that out. And, so now we're looking at ways to say, how can we get that insight faster and faster to businesses so you can get the right product in market, or even just in this case, the right messaging in market.
Chris, could you quote me a brand or a company which uses data very smart, in a smart way?
Sure, I'll choose our partners in the hackathon, Unilever. They're doing amazing things with data. I know there's several folks from Unilever here, so you're welcome. They have these people data centers where they actually have teams of analysts looking to solve problems and do analysis across the business units. Sean O'Neill, I think, is here. Sean's talked quite publicly about one of my favorite examples, which is around ice cream. And he may have talked about this here last year. So they did some studies looking at Twitter data to understand conversations that were happening around ice cream. And one of the things that they found was that nobody talks about ice cream on a Monday or a Tuesday. So think about that from an advertiser's perspective. If you're advertising on Monday or Tuesday, you're probably throwing money away because people aren't thinking about it on a Monday or Tuesday. They also found really interesting correlations to discussions about weather and ice cream. And it's not exactly what you'd expect. You would think, you know, hot weather, sunny, people are going to talk about ice cream. But they also noticed this correlation that volume of activity around ice cream grows as you move towards the weekend. And if there's a forecast for rain, there's a high correlation of people wanting to talk about ice cream because people talk about staying in and curling up with a book and, you know, and eating ice cream. And so you think about how they message and when they message and where they message, all driven by new insights around how customers, you know, talk about their products.
So let's talk about the future and what will be your main challenge in the future. And last question, I regret that the consumer doesn't sit here, but if Mr. and Mrs. Smith would sit in this chair, what would you say to him?
So I think, first of all, two areas that I see for us as big opportunities as a bank for the future. One of them is new partnerships, and I think with partnerships, not just the traditional open data exchange. A lot of times, you know, the stereotypical ones that people talk about, at least in financial services, is a bank and a telecoms and a retailer. Because as a bank, we always know where people spend their money, but we don't have basket view. So if we could get that, I mean, we could get even enrich our existing spending analytics by multiples. And then telecoms data, so we could real-time detect where our customers are, how are they moving around, with whom they're talking, how they're connected. So that's, again, another very, very big dimension for us. So I think open data exchange platforms, but at the same time, smaller scale partnerships with new startups where we can move really fast and start doing cross-selling, upselling of, you know, our respective products. Because we're a bank and we're heavily regulated, we can't easily just, you know, send out our data and share it. And the way we've started doing this kind of work is more around, we know our data, you know your data, what are the type of sort of targets you're looking for to coming and selling your products if you had access to another sort of 13 million customers that we can provide you with. And then we go and do the analytics ourselves and then sort of let you give us coupons, discounts to go after those customers. That's how we've started, you know, taking that approach to hopefully get our organization and regulators more comfortable around that. You know, this is very, very safe, secure. There is no exchange of personal information per se.
Say it to Mrs. Smith. Say it to Mrs.
Smith. As your bank, down the road, there is a lot of big surprises waiting for you. So most of the investment we're actually putting into the space is going to come back into your hands via a more seamless integrated approach with other providers that you have probably as part of your life. As we try to become a bank that really cares for you, we want you to feel that we actually know how you spend your money and what matters to you. And that if that includes travel companies, that includes grocery stores, we want to give you the right offers at the right time, in the right channel. And guess what, when it comes to channels, there's almost innovation, you know, that has started happening in that space, where we talk about, for example, messaging bots, chat bots, where we don't want to create even more friction with even more apps and even more, you know, whatever, promotions and campaigns via SMS, but it's all going to be in one shop, in one place, in one main channel of your choice, and that's how we're going to be engaging with you via a channel that, you know, cares about you. So,
Chris?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge certainly facing our business, but I would argue for probably all of us, is really education. Many of you probably have been coming to this conference for years, and we've been talking about a lot of the same issues for a long period of time, and I think it's easy to fall into this trap of thinking, hey, this isn't new anymore. But I'm telling you, as somebody that goes out and speaks to clients every single day, the biggest challenge is still, how do I do this? And what people are really wanting is hand-holding. They ultimately certainly want to fish, but a lot of them are still trying to figure out what a fish even looks like, to know if, before they can think about fishing on their own. And so I think education is the thing that's holding us back. For us personally, 5 years ago, we had to spend a lot of time trying to convince people that Twitter data was valuable. I mean, it was really, they were quite incredulous about that. Well, why do I care what somebody had for lunch? We do a lot less of that now. People kind of understand the fact that we have this massive archive of consumer expression and intent, so they understand the value of the data, but they're still really struggling with how to actually take advantage of it. So we have to do I'd love to be just the technologist that sits back and designs these amazing data products and then just unleashes them on the world. But the reality is we have to do the hard work of actually rolling up our sleeves and actually working directly with clients and showing them how to do the data science and helping them design their own systems in order to get there.
Both of you, will you pay Mr. or Mrs. Smith for all the data she gives you one day?
Will we pay her? We will reward her by delivering great services that she cares about. I mean, I think our message to Mrs. Smith is we're listening. Like, you're talking on Twitter because you want to be heard, and we're absolutely listening. This music's kind of ominous. Yes.
Same here. So I don't think we're going to pay our customers for their data. What we're going to do, we're going to give it back in more engaging,